Hello students. In this video we're going to finish up the endocrine glands. So we're going to take a look at the adrenal glands and we're going to take a look at the pancreas. Let's look at the adrenal glands first. If you look at the adrenal gland, they sit right on top of the kidneys, almost like little hats or pyramids. When you look at them, there are actually two glands in one. There's an outer gland, which is called the cortex, and there's an inner gland, which is called the medulla. If you look at it under a microscope, we can see these two glands. The cortex, the outer gland, remember the word cortex means rind, like an orange rind or watermelon rind. It's always on the outside. And then there's the medulla, and medulla means middle. It's in the middle. If you look here, you can see that the cortex is divided up into zones, and there are three zones. First, there's a capsule. That doesn't produce any hormones. And then we have the zona glomerulosa, which is the zone of little balls. The cells are arranged in little ball-like structures. The middle one is called the zona fasciculata, or the zone of cords or columns. And if you look, the cells look like they're stacked up. The inner one is called the zona reticularis. Reticularis means net or network. And you can see that it looks a little bit like a net, especially the blue part surrounding the cells. And then finally, remember, the middle is called the medulla. So again, they're paired, pyramid-shaped glands on top of the kidneys, and they're two glands in one. There's the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. Not only do these look different, they're also functionally different. The adrenal medulla is actually part of the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight nervous system. So it becomes very active when you're in a dangerous situation, when you start exercising, when you do anything that's stressful or anxiety producing. The cortex is completely different. It's glandular tissue that produces a whole bunch of steroids that have wide-ranging effects in the body. Let's look at the adrenal medulla first. Remember, it's part of the sympathetic nervous system, and so the hormones that come from it are similar to the neurotransmitters released by the sympathetic nervous system. If you remember the sympathetic nervous system, you have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. And the neurotransmitter from that postganglionic neuron is norepinephrine, also a little bit of epinephrine. Well, here it's exactly the same, but the amounts are reversed. We have much more epinephrine and much less norepinephrine. It's about an 80-20 ratio. Not only is it different that way, it's also different in that it's not a neurotransmitter. It's released into the bloodstream. So these are neurohormones. Hormones can go anywhere the bloodstream goes. And so even organs that are not connected by the nervous system can be affected by these hormones. Both of these hormones are amines, and that means that they're an amino acid that's been modified. They're water soluble, which means they're going to work through a second messenger system. They're regulated by the nervous system. So just like the rest of the sympathetic nervous system, a preganglionic neuron comes, and what it does here is it activates a gland instead of activating a postganglionic neuron. And then in return, we're going to release epi and norepi. It goes into the bloodstream. It has wide-ranging targets, things like muscles and heart and fat, even the liver. And it's going to prepare the body for fight or flight. So heart rate is going to increase, blood pressure is going to go up. We're going to start releasing glucose into the bloodstream so that it can nourish and provide energy for all those cells that are working. The digestive system gets shut down. So we're going to speed up the metabolism. We're going to open up the bronchial tubes so more air can get down into the lungs so we can have more oxygen. We're going to increase heart rate. We're going to increase blood pressure so that blood flow to the muscles will increase like crazy. There is a condition associated with this. sometimes a tumor of the adrenal medulla will form. This is called a pheochromocytoma. People with a pheochromocytoma, what happens is that irregularly, they actually go into fight or flight for no reason. And so they could be doing nothing that's dangerous, nothing that's anxiety provoking, and then all of a sudden they start going into fight or flight. Their heart rate jumps up, their blood pressure goes up, they become hot and sweaty and jumpy and so on. And it happens a lot. It can happen while you're sleeping, it can happen while you're having a meal, it can happen at any time. These people are then at a very high risk of things like stroke and heart attack. Let's look at the adrenal cortex. So remember, the word cortex means rind. So this is on the outside. Also remember, there are 3 layers or 3 zones, and they each produce steroids. They're called corticosteroids because they come from the cortex. Remember, the outer one is called the zona glomerulosa, the zone of little balls. These produce a set of hormones called mineralocorticoids. Well, look at this term. Oid means steroid. They're all steroids. Cortico means cortex. They come from the cortex. And mineralo refers to the fact that they affect mineral metabolism, specifically sodium and potassium. The middle one is called the zona fasciculata. Again, that means the zone of columns or cords. They produce a class of hormones called the glucocorticoids. So again, oids, steroid, cortico, cortex, and gluco refers to glucose metabolism. So they're going to affect things like blood sugar. The inner one, the zona reticularis, again, that means the zone of the area looks like a net or network. These produce hormones called the gonatocorticoids. Oid, steroids, cortico, cortex, gonad, those are the testes and ovaries. And the testes and ovaries produce sex hormones. And so these are very, very similar to the sex hormones from the gonads. Again, take a look at these zones. In this picture, you can see the zones. You may not be able to see the actual little balls or the columns, but you can certainly see where one zone ends and another zone begins. The easiest way to learn these and remember these is just to learn them in order. Glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis, and then medulla. It's always going to be that way. And so the easiest way to learn it is just maybe an acronym, GFRM. If you can remember that, you can remember the order. Here we've blown it up a little bit. Again, you're going to see the capsule that doesn't make any hormones. And then GFRM. Same thing here. Now this has a diagram and a photomicrograph. In the diagram, you can see the little balls. You can see the columns. You can see the net. And then you can see how the medulla looks completely different. But again, GFRM. The adrenal gland hormones, those are the cortex, have to do with 3 things. They have to do with salt, they have to do with sugar, and they have to do with sex. And so an easy way to think about them is the 3 S's. So salt, the mineralocorticoids, again, steroid, cortex, mineralo. And the minerals are sodium and potassium. Well, sodium and potassium are salts. Sodium chloride is table salt. And so it's going to affect the saltiness of your fluids. Middle one, glucocorticoids, steroids, cortex, glucose, sugar, blood sugar. And then the innermost gonatocorticoids, steroids, cortex, gonads. Remember, they produce the sex hormones. So salt, sugar, and sex. These are all steroids. And remember, steroids all come from cholesterol. So if you look at this flow chart, you can see the production of these hormones. Now, I'm not going to ask you to remember all these steps, but I do want you to look at it. So we take cholesterol, we go down, and it splits off into 3 different pathways. One pathway takes you to aldosterone, which is the primary mineralocorticoid. One pathway takes you to cortisol, which is the primary glucocorticoid. And one pathway takes you to androstenedione, testosterone, and estradiol, which are the primary gonadoccorticoids. Let's take a look at the mineralocorticoids. There are a bunch of these. What they do is they regulate sodium and potassium. Well, sodium and potassium, hopefully you remember, is very, very important for things like resting membrane potential and so on. Another thing about sodium, though, is water follows sodium. So wherever sodium goes, water follows it. So if sodium is outside your cells, water is going to go outside your cells. If sodium is in the blood system, water is going to flow to the blood and change the volume of blood. When you change the volume of blood, you're going to change blood pressure. And so sodium has a big effect on blood pressure. The most important mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. It's about 95% of the effects of the mineralocorticoids. And so usually it's the only one we talk about. Well, if we look at aldosterone, don't forget it's a steroid. All hormones from the adrenal cortex are steroids. Remember, they come from cholesterol. They're lipid soluble. And since they're lipid soluble, they work by direct gene activation. Hopefully you remember that. It goes in, it causes messenger RNA to be produced, and you get a new protein. The regulation of aldosterone is 2 different ways. It's a little bit unusual, but it's regulated by sodium and potassium, so it's humorally regulated. And it's also regulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary, so it's hormonally regulated. It's all about sodium and potassium, whether or not you save it or whether or not you get rid of it. And the organ that does that is the kidneys. And so the target of aldosterone is the kidney, specifically the kidney tubules. And what it does there is 2 different things. It makes you save sodium, and it makes you get rid of potassium. So we increase the reabsorption, the saving of sodium. And remember, water is going to follow it, so we're also going to save water. And then we increase the excretion, or getting rid of, potassium in the urine. Well, there are a couple of disorders associated with aldosterone. One is when you have too much. It's a hypersecretion. This is either called aldosteronism or sometimes Conn's disease. But think about this. Too much aldosterone means too much sodium, too much water. So your body's going to fill up with sodium and water. You're going to have puffy tissues. You're going to have edema. Blood's going to fill up. The blood volume is going to increase. And so you're going to have things like hypertension. And then don't forget, it makes you get rid of potassium. So you're going to have too little potassium in the body. When you have too little potassium, neurons don't work the way they're supposed to, and muscle cells don't work the way they're supposed to, including the heart. There's also a hyposecretion of aldosterone. It's called Addison's disease. And so Addison's disease, you have too little aldosterone, which means you're going to have too little sodium and too little water. And so you're going to be very dehydrated all the time. Not only that, but you're going to have too much potassium. And so you can wind up with, again, problems with things like the heart and so on. Another thing that happens with Addison's disease is, since you don't have aldosterone, and remember it was stimulated by ACTH, there's no negative feedback. So there's nothing telling ACTH to stop being released. So we wind up with a lot of ACTH. And ACTH in high amounts can affect skin cells. And so it makes the melanocytes active, and so a person's skin turns gold. Now, it's not uniform. It happens mostly on pressure spots, but it gives you a golden look about yourself. Now, in this picture, you can see that it's definitely not uniform. And places that are exposed to the sun get much darker. Places that are under pressure, like knuckles and elbows and anything like that, get much darker. But if you look at the far right picture, it looks like he has a nice golden tan. Let's look at the glucocorticoids. So the primary glucocorticoid is cortisol. So cortisol, remember, is a glucocorticoid. It's all about glucose. It's all about blood sugar. And so that's what its job is, to help keep blood sugar levels fairly constant. It also helps you maintain things like blood pressure. Again, remember, it comes from cholesterol, and it goes down this pathway, and then we get cortisol. Cortisol is regulated by ACTH, and so it has to do with things like patterns of activity level, patterns of eating, when you sleep, also stress. So sometimes this is called a stress hormone. Its primary effect is to make you slow down the use of glucose. It also makes your body produce more glucose. So we take fats and we take proteins and burn them and turn them into glucose. So glucose levels rise. Not only do glucose levels rise because we're burning fats and proteins, amino acid levels of the blood rise and fatty acid levels of the blood rise. And so all of those things are floating around in the blood. And so our cells have lots of possibility for energy. Again, it's a steroid, which means it's lipid soluble. That works by direct gene activation. It's regulated hormonally by ACTH. So it's under the control of the anterior pituitary. Again, its job is all about raising blood glucose and stopping you from burning glucose. And so instead of burning glucose, we burn fats, we burn proteins. It has a lot of targets: the liver, muscles, connective tissues, and so on. One other effect it has is it decreases inflammation. You may have kind of known that already, because if you get a rash and you go to the pharmacy to buy something for a rash, you probably buy something like cortisone or hydrocortisone. Well, those are almost identical to cortisol. They're also glucocorticoids. There's a condition which is a hypersecretion when you have too much cortisol. It's called Cushing's disease or Cushing's syndrome. Cushing's syndrome is an awful disease. It affects the entire body. Remember, the whole job of cortisol is to raise the blood sugar, prevent you from using sugar. And so instead, what you have to use is muscle. So we start to begin to tear down and burn muscle. We use fat. We tear down and begin to use fat. And so you have things like weight loss. You have all kinds of other things, hypertension, dehydration, and so on. There are a lot of visible symptoms of this disease. We get fat displacement. One of the places where the fat collects is between the shoulders, and so you get a buffalo hump. It also collects in the abdomen, and so the abdomen gets very, very heavy. Another thing that happens is too much cortisol causes connective tissues to begin to break down. And so the connective tissues in the skin begin to break down. That heavy abdomen then causes extreme stretch marks, and they tend to turn purple. We also get a very round face. It's called a moon face. There are all kinds of symptoms associated with Cushing's disease. Here you can see this pendulous abdomen and moon face on the left. Here you can see this buffalo hump. And then You can see those purple stretch marks or striae. Let's look at the gonatocorticoids. Remember, these come from the zona reticularis. Most of these are going to be male sex hormones. Male sex hormones are called androgens. Andro means male, and gen means to create. And remember, they start out as androstenedione, but they're converted into testosterone. And they can also be further converted into estrogen. And so what happens is you have this surge of hormones, and it may have something to do with the onset of puberty and the onset of secondary sex characteristics. And in females especially, it contributes to the sex drive. If you follow the pathway, you can see how it follows down all the way to androstenedione. And then in the tissues themselves, the peripheral tissues, not the cortex, androstenedione then gets converted into testosterone and then further converted into estrogen or estradiol. It's normal to have sex hormones in adults. It is not normal to have sex hormones in children or babies. And so when it happens, we get very dramatic effects. And so it depends on the hormone and which gender it's associated with. But you can get precocious puberty, which means that it's the right kind of puberty. It just happens at a very early age. But if it's the wrong hormone, then you can begin to look like the opposite gender. And so when you look at this is actually a female. Now, when you look at it, it looks like a male. But you have what's called a pseudopenis. You have masculinizing effects. You can also have very early puberty. If you look at the girl on the left, look, she's 3 years old, but she already has breasts, and she started menstruating at 17 months old. If you look on the right, that's a little boy. He's 2.5. And yet when you look at him, he already is beginning to grow pubic hair. His face is changing. He has an enlarged penis. So both of these are precocious puberty because they're normal for these to happen. It's just happening at way too young an age. This is much more common in females than it is in males. Let's look at the last gland we're going to look at, and that is the pancreas. So when you look at the pancreas is sort of a triangular shaped gland. It's right behind the stomach. It's a gland that sort of has two completely different jobs. One part of this gland is exocrine. An exocrine, crin means to secrete, exo to the outside. The secretions here leave the pancreas and enter the small intestine. They're digestive enzymes. And then we have an endocrine portion. Crin means to secrete, endo to the inside. Here, we secrete into the body fluids, and so we're getting hormones. The exocrine portion of the gland is a bunch of tiny little flask-shaped glands called acinar glands. And again, they're going to produce digestive enzymes. The endocrine portion is confined to little areas. It looks sort of like little islands. They're called islets of Langerhans or pancreatic islets. They produce two different hormones. So when you look, you'll see two different types of cells. There are alpha cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon. And then there are beta cells, and beta cells produce insulin. So here's what that gland looks like, and you can see how it's situated, associated with a small intestine. If you look, there's a pancreatic duct that runs all the way through it, and an accessory duct. Both of these empty into the small intestine. So that's where those digestive enzymes are going to go. You can see that it looks bumpy. These are little lobules, and it looks like it has sort of a head and a tail. If you look at it under a microscope, it's easy to see the endocrine and exocrine portions. By far, the greatest amount is going to be the exocrine glands, those little acinar glands. But every so often, you see little islands. These little islands or islets are where the endocrine portion is. If we look at an islet, it looks like this. All around it are those acinar glands. So it's easy to tell these apart. Remember, there are two different types of cells in this islet. Well, they're hard to see in this picture, but if we use the right stains, we can separate them. So if you use a combination stain, you'll see that some cells stain red and some cells stain blue. The ones that stain red, those are the alpha cells, and they're the ones that produce glucagon. The ones that stain blue, those are the beta cells, and those are the ones that produce the hormone insulin. Well, both of these hormones are all about maintaining a normal blood glucose level. So whenever we do just about anything, it affects our blood glucose level. If you eat, if you don't eat, if you exercise, if you don't exercise, all those things affect blood glucose. So sometimes blood glucose level is rising. So you've just eaten a snack, blood glucose goes up. Well, the pancreas monitors that. And what it does is it releases insulin from those beta cells. And then that insulin causes the cells of the body to pull the sugar out of the blood, either for storage or for use. Once you pull it out of the blood, blood glucose levels go down. If you haven't eaten in a while, though, or maybe you started exercising, blood glucose levels tend to fall because we're burning up or using the glucose. Well, again, the pancreas is going to monitor that. But now it's going to release the hormone glucagon. And what glucagon does is it's going to raise blood glucose. And it does this primarily by telling the liver to release stored glucose. But once the liver starts releasing glucose, blood glucose levels go back up, and we're back to normal again. Now, there is no true normal, but the range is between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter. And so the average is about 90 milligrams. Let's look at glucagon first. So glucagon is a peptide, which means it's water soluble, which means it's going to work by a second messenger. It's humorally regulated. It's regulated by blood glucose. So when blood glucose levels fall, the pancreas is going to release glucagon. Glucagon is going to go to the liver, its target, and it's going to cause the liver to release stored glucose. It also causes the liver to make new glucose. So we have two terms here. One is called glycogenolysis. Lysis means to cut or to break. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose. So we're going to chop it up, we're going to break it apart, and we're going to release the glucose. The other one is gluconeogenesis. Genesis means to create. Neo means new. And gluco refers to glucose. So not only is the liver going to release stored glucose, it's going to build new glucose and release that as well. So if you look at this, here's our little seesaw, and it went down. So declining levels of blood glucose, pancreas is going to note that, release glucagon. We're going to stimulate the release of glucose from the liver. Again, this is by two processes. One is glycogenolysis, and the other one is gluconeogenesis. There is a problem associated with glucagon, and that's hypoglycemia. In other words, you have too low a blood sugar. Well, when you have too low a blood sugar, it's bad because some parts of your body can use other sources like fats or proteins, but the central nervous system cannot use anything for energy except glucose. And so what happens when your blood glucose levels fall, the first system to have an effect is the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord. And so what happens is as it begins to fall a little bit, you start feeling weak and maybe a little nauseated, and then you might a little lower, you start twitching and trembling, and you may not know exactly where you are. You feel dizzy, vertigo, goes down a little further. You might get angry, you have behavioral changes, you might have slurred speech. Goes down even further, you go into a coma, and it goes down even further and you die. So we cannot allow our blood sugar to drop. So here are some of the symptoms of low blood sugar. You can also have low blood sugar because of having too much insulin. And so if you watch this short video, you can see what happens to a goldfish. So we took a goldfish, and they have two bowls. One bowl has just plain old normal water in it. The other one has insulin. And then we're going to have a bowl with glucose. So we're going to take the fish out of the normal bowl, and we're going to put it into the bowl with insulin. Well, insulin is absorbed across the gills. And what it's going to do is it's immediately going to begin to cause the blood sugar in that fish to drop. So within a few minutes, you'll notice the behavior begin to change. The fish starts twitching. Every once in a while, it'll turn over on its side, but it'll right itself, and then it'll swim weird. If you wait a few more minutes, it turns on its side much more often, and it's not able to keep itself upright. In a few more minutes, as the blood sugar continues to drop, what's going to happen is it's going to stay on its side. It's going to stop swimming, and basically it's going to enter a comatose state. So within that 20 minutes, this fish's blood sugar dropped to the point that it went into a coma. If you left it in here much longer, the fish would probably die. But we're not going to do that. We're going to take the fish out, and we're going to put it into a bowl that has glucose in it. So now what we're going to see is the effects of rising blood sugar. They're way too low, but the water has glucose in it. Glucose will also be absorbed across the gills, and watch what happens. We get all the same symptoms, but in reverse. So in a few minutes, it's going to start swimming, but not able to hold itself upright. It's going to twitch and so on. We give it another few more minutes, and it'll be back to normal again. And this is exactly what happens to humans when they give themselves too much insulin. Again, here's some of those symptoms of low blood sugar. And so you can see, if you remember exactly the thing that happened to the fish, this is what happens to humans as well. Another condition associated with glucagon is a hypersecretion. So if you have too much glucagon, your blood sugar is going to be too high. This is a very rare condition. Hypoglycemia is much more common. Okay, let's look at the other hormone. The other hormone, remember, came from the beta cells, those that stained blue, is insulin. So insulin is a protein. It's not very big, but it's two chains of amino acids. And so since it's two chains, it's a protein. It's only 52 amino acids long, but it's still water soluble. It's also going to work by a second messenger, but it has the exact same target as glucagon. And so we have to use different second messengers. So for glucagon, it was cyclic AMP. For insulin, it's PIP2. Insulin is also regulated by blood glucose. So when blood glucose levels rise, we release insulin. Remember, insulin's job is to lower the blood glucose. It has two targets. One is the liver, and the other is most body cells. And so at most body cells, it allows those cells to absorb the insulin from the blood. At the liver, it causes the liver to start storing glucose. So when we look at insulin, what it does is it lowers blood glucose levels, primarily by allowing the transport of glucose into cells, into fat and into muscle cells. And then remember, it's also going to go to the liver. And so at the liver, it's going to stop the liver from releasing glucose and start causing the liver to store glucose. So when we look at this, here's our little seesaw, rising glucose levels. Pancreas notes that, releases insulin. It goes to the liver, and then most body cells. At most body cells, we're going to increase uptake for use, and at the liver, we're going to cause it to store. So instead of taking glycogen and chopping it up like we did before, we're going to take glucose and connect it together to form glycogen. There's definitely an endocrine disorder associated with insulin, and that's diabetes mellitus. So remember we talked about diabetes insipidus before. The word diabetes, remember, it means lots and lots of urine. But in this case, diabetes mellitus, mellitus means sweet. So that urine is sweet. It has sugar in it. And so when you look at the effects of diabetes mellitus, there are always three signs. There are three cardinal signs. We're going to get a lot of urine. That's polyuria. When you produce a lot of urine, you're going to be very thirsty. So we're going to have a lot of thirst and drink a lot of water. That's polydipsia. And then remember, we're losing glucose. Our primary energy source is just going down the toilet. And when that happens, you're going to be very, very hungry. And so you have excessive hunger and food consumption. Diabetes mellitus affects all parts of the body. There are no organs that are not affected by diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus can cause things like sudden weight loss. You're always hungry, even though you're hungry and eating, you still lose weight. It can cause things like constant urination. You're always thirsty. But it causes problems with nerves. It causes problems with blood vessels. You don't heal very quickly. You're always tired. Females can have things like vaginal infections. You can wind up with blindness and blurry vision. There are no organs that are not affected by diabetes mellitus. There's one other one, and this is called hyperinsulinism, and this is exactly what we saw when we looked at the fish. So remember, we gave that fish too much insulin, and that's exactly what happens when blood sugar levels fall. Insulin causes the sugar to drop, and remember what happened with the fish. We went through all those stages. So one last time, let's look at this, and you'll see the little seesaw, and you can see what happens when you go up, and you can see what happens when you go down.